On the 12th of May 1940, columns of German tanks emerged from the Ardennes forest to unleash a new weapon of warfare: blitzkrieg. In just a few days, the attackers had shattered Allied lines and were driving the defenders towards the Channel coast and the port of Dunkirk. Standing in the way of catastrophe were small groups of defenders sacrificing their own freedom and lives to stem the tide in desperate last stands. This is the story of just one such group who fell into the hands of the notorious SS in what became known as the Le Paradis massacre. That German assault had been so effective it had split the Allies in two. To the south, French forces had turned 90 degrees to defend Paris, and in the north, a salient had formed around the Channel ports. It was here, on this southern flank of the Dunkirk pocket, that the greatest danger lay. Senior British commanders were aware of the perilous situation. By the time Boulogne fell and Calais was cut off on the 25th of May, the evacuation from the last remaining port of Dunkirk was underway. In order for it to succeed, the perimeter had to be held at all costs. Enter the 2nd Royal Norfolk Regiment. A professional infantry battalion, they had a solid reputation as a reliable unit and found themselves by the 25th of May along the La Bassée Canal on the southern flank of the pocket. Amongst their ranks were these men: 28-year-old former postman and London native Bert Pooley. Standing at over 6 feet tall, he was a keen boxer and well regarded amongst his comrades in A Company. 19-year-old Private Bob Brown, a talented amateur artist, he served in the Norfolk's headquarters company as a signaller. And finally, 26-year-old Private Bill O'Callaghan. Born in London but raised in Norfolk, he had joined the regular army aged 18 back in 1932. Standing at 5 feet 6 inches and a quiet but reliable soldier, he typified many of those within the Norfolk's ranks. As part of the 4th Infantry Brigade, the Norfolks had already been heavily engaged in the previous days, but despite heavy losses, remained a potent force on the battlefield. That said, like most British units, they were severely limited in artillery and anti-tank support. Their job though was clear: delay the German advance for as long as possible. Time was everything. The longer they held, the more men could live to fight another day. Records tell us that the 2nd Norfolks under their commander Major Lyle Ryder had taken up positions between two villages known as Rueil du Vinage and Le Cornet-Malo, covering a stretch of some 2 miles by dawn on the 26th of May. Set back from the La Bassée Canal into hedgerows, buildings and tree lines, men peered southwards, preparing to repel any crossing attempts with small arms, mortars and anti-tank rifles. The real danger point though came from this position: the Bois de Pacaut, a wooded area which extended from the canal towards the British lines and offered cover for advancing troops. It was close to a key crossroads that the Norfolks had been given the ominous order to defend to the last man and last round. Beyond that crossroads, perhaps a mile away, was the battalion headquarters in the small village of Le Paradis. Facing them across this canal were men of the infamous 3rd SS Totenkopf Division, part of Panzergruppe Hoth. As SS troops are not a regular army formation, they were political soldiers, members of the Nazi Party, often indoctrinated to the worst of Nazi ideology. Contrary to popular belief, the Totenkopf were not highly regarded at this time in terms of fighting ability. On the 21st of May, they had found themselves in the path of a British armoured counterattack south of the town of Arras, and several of their units had been easily brushed aside with considerable loss. Unfortunately, one aspect of their reputation was true from the very start: their brutality. In the few days that they had been in action in the West, men of the division had already committed numerous war crimes, a pattern which would continue. Dawn on the 26th saw the renewal of the German offensive, with a rain of mortar and artillery shells slamming into British positions, depleting the Norfolk's ranks throughout the morning. This bombardment was followed up by SS troops managing to cross the La Bassée Canal and infiltrating the Bois de Pacaut. With the bridgehead over the canal and more men reinforcing all the time, the situation was perilous. It was only a timely bayonet charge by the men of A Company, including Bert Pooley, who saved the situation. driving the enemy through the wood back towards the canal with considerable loss. Throughout the remainder of the day, German probing attacks were made across the canal at various points, all the time whittling down the defenders' numbers. Each was repulsed with heavy losses to the attackers, but with dwindling ammunition and massively outnumbered, it was clear the defence couldn't last. At 3:30 am on the 27th of May, a huge concentration of German artillery and mortar fire once again hit the defenders' positions, and repeated attacks from fresh troops supported by armour finally drove into and through the Norfolk's lines. By this time the companies were so badly depleted that Bert Pooley's A Company could muster only 7 men. And with no hope of further resistance, the remnants of the Norfolks began a fighting withdrawal back towards their makeshift headquarters a mile away. Despite the enormous odds, the Norfolks put up a stern defence, as 17-year-old SS man Herbert Bruniger described.
The English defend themselves with incredible bravery and doggedness. Again, the losses in terms of wounded and dead pile up. Again, we are completely pinned to the ground in front of the enemy, who is totally invisible and whose ability commands our admiration. We have to adapt ourselves completely to the enemy's tactics. We work ourselves forward by creeping, crawling and slithering along. The enemy retreats skillfully and without showing himself.
That headquarters, the last refuge for the Norfolks, was to be found right here, at Jurier Farm, a brick-built farmhouse with large barn, also known as the cowshed, to one side, forming a rough L shape. Manned by only headquarters staff, signallers and a scattering of infantry who had managed to withdraw from the fighting line, no more than 100 men in all, they prepared to fight to the last. Private Bob Brown with battalion headquarters described the scene.
Soon, all available men were ordered to take up defensive positions. I handed over the switchboard to Porky Ward, who was on the radio to brigade. The adjutant, Captain Long, sent me forward to a line of trees and told me to give him advance warning of the enemy coming between the forward companies and Battalion HQ. I was there for quite some time and then moved back a bit to some buildings at the crossroads, which was more secure. There, I found Lance Corporal Garner of the Regimental Police, and it made me feel better to be with someone else. He went and looked through a door towards Battalion HQ, then called me over and pointed to a German motorcycle and sidecar fitted with a machine gun coming from behind us. We quickly lined up our rifles. He said, "You take the one in the sidecar and I'll take the one on the bike." We both fired together and the bike ran into a ditch. Our next move was to get back to the farm and let them know the enemy was behind them. The opposite side of the road was an estimate, with the door open. So, running faster than I had for quite some time, we dashed across the road and got inside safely. It was easy to crawl along the hedge, and we passed the bike in the ditch. We could see they were both dead.
One of those men leading that German assault, though not directly against the Norfolks but the Royal Scots to their right, was Hauptmann Fritz Nochlein, commanding No. 3 Company of the Totenkopf 2nd Rifle Regiment. Reportedly, Nochlein had witnessed the impressive British marksmanship firsthand and had lost many men in the advance, something which added to the growing frustration of the badly delayed attackers who were unable to dislodge the stubborn defenders. In the hamlet of Le Paradis, the situation was now incredibly serious for the Norfolks, who were short of men, food and most importantly, ammunition. With growing numbers of wounded, communications to brigade headquarters cut and the enemy spotted working around their flanks, the only possible chance for escape was to retreat northwards in an attempt to break clear of the enemy advance and rejoin the withdrawing BEF. But for any chance of success, they needed to hold out till nightfall. Bob Brown described the situation in the early afternoon as battalion headquarters came under fire.
Mortar bombs were coming over and landing in the open space between the house and the barn. One exploded and caused several casualties, and I thought I was hit, but it was only stones and rubble thrown into the farm. John Hagan was next to me and said, "Go on, we'll find somewhere safer than this." At the end of the barn was a small brick shed with a tile roof, so we went in there and knocked bricks out to make loopholes. Whenever we saw the enemy creeping along the ditches or dodging behind a hedge, we opened fire. They dropped from sight, but that didn't mean that they were hit, as a near miss made you get down. Bill was in a weapon pit in front of the barn with a Bren gun. When he fired an automatic, the Germans threw over more mortar bombs. So we shouted to him to fire single shots only. All through the day we were attacked, and the house was hit several times until it was on fire.
The Norfolks held on for several more hours and fought back with what little they could. Heavy small arms exchanges caused more casualties to the attackers, including, notably, Standartenführer Gotz, commander of the Totenkopf's 3rd Regiment, who was shot and killed by a sniper outside Le Paradis Church. But with the farmhouse roof set alight and enemy troops and armour closing in, there was no chance of escape. By now, all the British outlying buildings had fallen silent, and only the defenders of the farm and cowshed clung on. Realising the hopelessness of the situation, Major Ryder addressed the surviving men left fighting from the barn. Bert Pooley was there.
After some discussion amongst ourselves, it was decided that with the approval of our commanding officer that no further useful purpose would be served by fighting on, and in order to save the wounded, we would surrender to the German forces. The first attempt to surrender was made by 3 men who walked into the open displaying a white cloth. They immediately came under heavy machine gun fire. The second attempt was then made by all of us running out into the open with our hands in the air. No further fire came from the enemy, who stood up and cheered, and a German officer ordered us to come forward with our hands in the air.
At the same time the men in the barn were taken prisoner, a smaller group, including Bob Brown, were emerging from the burning ruins of the farmhouse.
Bill, John, and myself thought that if we kept in the smoke from the burning house, we might make it. We went out of the side door into a ditch beside the road. When we dropped into the ditch, we found the adjutant and the medical officer were there, peering over the top of the ditch, ready to get away. We found we were too late. The enemy was already coming up the road. John took aim with his rifle, but the adjutant said, "Don't fire, Egan." If he had, that would have just opened up and killed us all.
They weren't to know it, but they would be incredibly fortunate to escape what was about to unfold. For those taken prisoner in the barn, most bleeding from wounds and all utterly exhausted, things immediately took a sinister turn. Force marched across these gardens into this field. Under a hail of kicks and rifle butts, men were searched, robbed, and most ominously, relieved of their identity discs. Here's Bert Pooley again.
We were lined up and searched. Our helmets were struck from our heads and our equipment and gas masks were forcibly removed. We had no weapons with us, as these had been destroyed before we surrendered. We were told by an English-speaking German NCO that any wounded could sit down, whereupon some of us did. I was one of those. I had been hit in the left arm and right hip, but not seriously wounded. But no sooner had I sat down that I received a brutal kick in the ribs from a German soldier and was ordered to stand up.
Accounts tell us that around this time the group of Norfolks had been joined by a scattering of other prisoners from the Royal Scots, Royal Signals, Royal Artillery, and even a lone French soldier who'd been fighting with the battalion since the 26th. Together, they now began a march down this very lane, stopping twice to allow the stream of German troops and vehicles, finally able to push on, to race headlong after the withdrawing British. Also present at that time was SS soldier Herbert Brunegger, who, armed with a camera, snapped this haunting photograph showing men of the Norfolks being marched away to their fate. Amongst that group, now numbering 99 men, standing right here on this country lane in northern France, was Private Bill O'Callaghan.
We halted on the road, about 200 yards from where we had been searched, to let some vehicles pass. We started off again to march along the road and met German troops who behaved in a very brutal manner towards us. hitting us with their rifles and pushing us about. On the march, we halted once or twice, and it was possible that one of those halts occurred just before we turned off into a gateway leading into the farm. On passing through this gateway, I noticed a pasture on our right, a farm building on our left. As I was turning into the gateway, I noticed a machine gun in front of us, which appeared to be mounted in front of what I thought looked like a farm lavatory. After having passed through the gateway, the gun was then on my right. The whole column continued to march forward along the side of the house, with their hands still behind their heads. And suddenly, firing started. The men started falling from the front of the column. When I saw the men falling, I threw myself forward and fell into a slight depression on the ground, and in falling stretched my arms out before me and sustained a slight flesh wound to the left arm. After the firing stopped, I heard my comrades shouting and shrieking in their agony. I then heard what sounded to me like the fixing of bayonets. Shortly afterwards, I heard moans and shrieks from more of my comrades, which sounded to me as if they were being bayoneted.
In a matter of just a few seconds, 2 machine guns firing at less than 30 yards range had decimated the column of unarmed prisoners, who fell upon each other into a hastily dug pit running in front of this barn. Perhaps more than 50 men were killed outright. Then the shooting began again. Over the course of the next few minutes, dozens of men were shot point blank or bayoneted where they lay. Bert Pooley, incredibly, survived the carnage.
Further shooting then started with revolvers and rifles from the edge of the hole. One of the men beneath me moved, and 2 shots were fired into the heap of bodies, both of which hit me in the left leg. At the sound of a whistle, firing ceased, and all the Germans appeared to move away.
Despite the pain and shock of what had happened, Bert recalled the following.
The thought stabbed my brain. If I ever get out of here, the swine that did this will pay for it.
In a matter of minutes, it was all over. Their murder complete, the men of Nochlein's 3rd Company, 2nd Totenkopf Infantry Regiment left Le Paradis, never to return. It wasn't until nightfall that Bill O'Callaghan, who, utterly exhausted, had fallen asleep, was shaken awake amongst the pile of corpses by a badly wounded Bert Pooley, the only other survivor of the massacre. With a shattered left leg, Bert was dragged by Bill across to a wood pile located here, before slowly making their way across these fields to this farm where they found shelter in a pigsty. For 3 days and nights they stayed there, surviving on raw potatoes and filthy water, until, on the 4th day, Madame Creton, the farm's owner, found them. Nursing the pair as best she could, it was ultimately decided that, given the seriousness of Bert's wound, there was no option but to hand themselves in. Terrified of the repercussions if it became known what they'd seen, neither man spoke of that day at Le Paradis. Bill O'Callaghan remained a prisoner of war until 1945, though Bert was eventually repatriated home in October 1943, when finally he could tell the tale of what he saw that day. Nobody believed him. It was not until after O'Callaghan finally returned that the authorities took Pooley's claims more seriously. And when in 1946 Bert returned to Le Paradis and met Madame Creton once again, finally an investigation was launched. Before long, Private Pooley was on the trail of Fritz Nochlein, the man responsible for the murder of his friends. Ultimately traced to a POW camp in Sheffield, England, Nochlein was returned to Germany to stand trial in Hamburg in October 1948. Thanks largely to the testimony of Bill O'Callaghan and Bert Pooley, Fritz Nochlein was found guilty and hanged at Hamelin Prison on the 28th of January 1949. Bert had kept his promise. The site of the massacre at Le Paradis, just one of many war crimes committed in that area at that time, is commemorated by a plaque adorning the wall against which the victims were shot. and a memorial standing outside the Creton farm, erected in 1991, remembering those 97 men who lost their lives that spring day in 1940. Those men who gave their lives so that others at Dunkirk might live, never left France. Today they lie in a Commonwealth War Graves cemetery in the village of Le Paradis, a little over a mile from the site of the massacre. Their sacrifice a testament not only to the brutality of war, but of courage shown by so many in those dark days of 1940. They were joined by one more man in 1982, Bert Pauley, who, according to his wishes, had his ashes scattered alongside his mates. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us keep making videos like this, why not check out our Patreon community at the link below, where we release full-length virtual tours, not available here on YouTube, every fortnight, ranging from medieval to the modern day. Your support is hugely appreciated. And for those wanting to know more about the events of the 27th of May 1940, we can recommend the excellent website leparadismassacre.com, which contains a huge amount of information on the events of that day. That's all this time. See you again soon.